Hello everyone, CrystalFissure here, and I'm here with my American counterpart, Andrew, who you may have seen on my channel in the comment sections and whatnot, and we're here with a very special guest. We are here with Josh Mancell, who you may know as the producer of some of the iconic Crash Bandicoot soundtracks, Jak and Daxter, and has worked with many people and many more projects, which we'll be happy to get into. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you guys. Well, I've met Andrew before, but it's nice to meet you specifically.
And welcome, Andrew, as well, because you've been a fan for a while, and you've always you were the one that has all these industry connections, so to speak. So it's glad to finally get you on the channel as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, glad to be here. Glad to be here.
All right, so we might as well just get straight into it. We might as well ask with the sort of the basics. So, how old were you when you first started to get into music?
Well, I guess it all sort of kicked off when I was about 7 or 8 years old. That's when I started taking piano lessons, and it's also around the same time that I received my first record. So those two events sort of jettisoned me into my music journey. So
yeah, and what was it that sort of got you into sort of scoring more specifically?
Scoring came many years later. I did study composition in college, and I did take a music for film class. I didn't actually get to score anything, but there were all these kind of hypothetical assignments, like here's a creative brief for an imaginary commercial.
Right.
You know, we wanted to set, my teacher was basically acting as the producer or the ad agency, and he would like set forth like a scenario for a commercial, and then we were composing music to go along with this imaginary commercial. But my first real scoring came after I moved out to LA after I graduated from college and started working at Mark Mothersbaugh's studio. So my first real scoring gigs started in 1992, 1993, just doing odds and ends for commercials. Just kind of random small jobs, and then it's kind of ramped up from there into doing video game stuff and TV series and films and whatnot.
Yeah, did you have any major influences when starting out?
Well, I tend to say this a lot, but I do believe this, that my primary influence in my scoring is always the project itself. And I try to get as much inspiration from what I'm looking at, or what the story is, or whatever things that a project can reveal. I try to draw upon that. The other thing that I should say is that the direction you take isn't necessarily your own decision. You're always collaborating with a director and having to have approval from a director and also producers. So it's a collaboration, and I'd say your best shot at like putting your own first best ideas is really right at the beginning. If you've read a script or if you've seen some conceptual art, then you can sort of like take that, into your own process, and whatever your initial demos would probably reflect what your, whatever you see fit as far as a first best idea before they, shoot you down and make it better.
Yeah.
Funny you say that, actually, because if I'm scoring a film right now with some people out in California, and like working with the director, it can be like a nightmare, because the director has a vision and he wants that scene to be played a certain way. And if it's not that certain way, he throws a fit.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same.
Well, you know what? It's in charge. This is like, the director is, depending on what the producer situation is, but, he's a filmmaker, and he's in charge of the, he has to have the holistic vision. He's trying to bring the best out of his actors. He's, framing up visually what he wants, and he's also, in charge of marrying that to whatever his sound world is. So
yeah, and it's definitely not a music or movie exclusive sort of issue or direction. It definitely applies to even the industry I'm in, which is web design and stuff like that. Clients wanting specific things moved over to here and there, and it's like it can seem like such a minor thing to you, but to them it's everything. So I guess that it's the same thing with music.
It's absolutely everything.
Yeah. And so given the fact that you moved on with Crash and stuff like that, you were using computers, electronics, like how was the learning process for that, learning sort of more modern technology at the time?
Well, I really lucked out because my last year of college, they brought a computer into the music studio at my college. So up until that point, I had learned how to splice tape and do a lot of, like basically old school analog recording.
Awesome.
And it wasn't until my last year there that we didn't get into digital audio. That actually was something I learned after I started working at Mutato. But as far as MIDI sequencing goes, I actually did learn that during my last year of college. And that was one of the first questions that was asked of me before I started working for Mark was, do you know how to do MIDI sequencing? Do you use, Studio Vision? And I was like, yes, I just learned that. So it was absolutely
very convenient timing. Yeah.
Oh my
convenient.
God. Yeah.
Super convenient.
Yeah. I'd been like a couple years older. I would have been like, you want me to splice some tape for you? It's like definitely good timing. So yeah, I learned the basics of MIDI sequencing in college, and I just, took it further, obviously, once I started to have to really produce a lot of music.
Yeah.
On demand. So
did it inspire you when you started using that equipment? Like, what inspired you to want to use it? So using MIDI to make music, like what was inspiring about it? Like, what made you continue using it to make music versus playing a guitar or a real instrument?
Well, I'm a drummer primarily, so for someone who's like, I can get around on keyboard, but I'm not really like, a chop oriented player per se.
Right.
So, when you're doing, and I'll just say that when you're doing MIDI sequencing, obviously you kind of have a lot at your disposal in terms of how you orchestrate things. And, I wouldn't have been, even if I knew how to play cello and French horn and, lap steel guitar and marimba, it would have been very hard back then to track all that stuff live, especially given that I wasn't using my own equipment. I was working at Mark's studio, so I was, basically given a pretty, not primitive, but a pretty basic setup to execute things. So I guess the inspiration came out of limitation. Like, what can I do with this?
Fair enough.
So what was your initial reaction when you found out that you were chosen to do a score for a video game to work with Naughty Dog on Crash Bandicoot?
Well, Crash wasn't my first game.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, I had worked on a video game called Johnny Mnemonic the year before.
Yes, yeah.
And, that's sort of what put me first in line as far as being chosen to submit for the Crash project. So like with any project, I had to submit, like I was saying earlier, my first best ideas for what the music might sound like. And I was given kind of a lot of different directions. We want it to be, part of the creative brief was we want it to be fun and catchy. And then the other part of it was we want it to be sort of non-traditional and maybe a little bit more ambient and not quite so heavy on the, wall-to-wall melody tunes type soundtrack. So I did my best to cover all that when I turned in my initial demos. So I did a pair of cues that were, pretty catchy and cartoony. And then I did another pair that were a little bit more experimental and moody, or mood-based, I should say.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your
No, that
question.
does.
I sort of
well.
took.
Yep.
That's fine.
How much collaboration did you have with Naughty Dog when producing Crash Bandicoot / Jak Daxter soundtracks?
Well, the whole thing was a collaboration. You don't work in a vacuum. So I was clearly, brought on to, provide music and provide ideas for music. So the collaboration for Crash actually was very orderly and went very well because I was working with a dedicated music producer, Dave Baggett. And he was brought on early in the project, and we're the same age and listened to a lot of the same music. So we actually struck up a pretty strong friendship bond to go along with our, professional duties as composer and music producer. So that process actually was very close. And I would write music during the week, and Dave would come up usually on Friday afternoons and listen to what I was working on and offer up ideas and possibly some revision notes. And then he would take mixes to Naughty Dog, and they would play them throughout the following week. And he would come back and, kind of tell me what the general consensus was.
And
now this, Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and did you get any visual cues, like seeing like the way the level looked, like artwork or anything like that? Or was it more just going on a vibe or what they had sort of directed to you?
There was a lot offered to me in terms of visuals, which was really great.
Yeah.
We were given a little Xeroxed handbook called, I think it's when they were still calling it Willy the Wombat. So it was basically just like, this is what this character looks like, and it kind of gave the backstory and character descriptions, and you could kind of get a feel for, the personalities of the different boss characters and Crash himself and, Cortex and all these characters in the game. And pretty soon after I started working on it, I was able to go to Naughty Dog and actually play through all these levels as they were being worked on. So that was really, really great in terms of just getting my hands on the controller and saying like, okay, this is what this, this snow level feels like, and you're kind of sliding around the ice, and you're, it's a full experience. So that was all very helpful.
Yeah, and I guess it's almost like the next step beyond even scoring a film soundtrack, because like you're directly in control of what you explore, what you choose to see, and whatnot.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely that sort of non-linear quality that games have, where you can sort of like go off the grid if you want to. Or, I mean, that was definitely the case with Jak and Daxter. That was much more of a free roaming environment. The Crash games were pretty much, you were still kind of running on a track, even though you couldn't see it,
Yeah, they hid that very well. Very sort of lush, detailed line, essentially. And so, regarding technical limitations and stuff like that, so what sort of limitation did you come across, given the fact that you were essentially writing to a CD? I couldn't imagine what it would have been like if you were doing an N64 soundtrack, which was Sony's competition, and that had like even less expansive, space to put tracks on. So what was it like on the PS1?
Well, I'll start with the newfound freedom first, which is I didn't have to use a general MIDI palette, which was great, because I had been they fed us some pre-existing video game music for another game that one of the producers had worked on, and it definitely sounded like it was from the 80s. And this was like early 96, so we were like well into the 90s, and I was just kind of like, do I really have to use these type of sounds? And they were like, no, you can actually like use your own samples if they're short enough, and if they sound good knocked down to a low sample rate, then you can use your own sounds. And I was like, great, well, I can that's definitely liberating, because I can make interesting music using my own sound palette. Now, the limitations part of it was that I was delivering MIDI sequences as opposed to giving them straight up stereo mixes for them to stream. And that's the way I did the first 4 Crash games and the first 2 Jak and Daxter games. And it wasn't until the 3rd Jak game that I was able to just give them stereo mixes, and they would stream the audio off the actual disc. So to go back to what I was saying earlier about the sample-based MIDI score, that was definitely limiting in that I couldn't use a lot of sustained notes.
Right.
Some instruments sounded better than others once they got into the game, and that's why you notice when you listen to the pre-console mixes that I post on SoundCloud, you can hear, with multi-samples and some of my own effects, and just like the fully realized version of how I wanted all the console mixes to sound like.
Yeah.
Well, though that explains why music in Jak and Daxter, like Jak 3 is, like you said, stereo mix. Like it's like a pre-recorded like MP3 or WAV file, and the ones on the like the ones in Jak 2 and the Crash games are literally sample libraries that are stored within the disc that are played back via MIDI sequence that's also stored on the disc.
And you probably. I was going to say, you probably... I
played with those samples.
You probably already know that a lot of people using some programs have actually ripped your sounds from the game, and actually people have like made remixes using those exact sounds. Like some of the more eclectic sort of samples have been, you can actually hear them in fan remixes and stuff like that because of what you just said. So.
Yep, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
I sent him one.
I was gonna turn it into a joke and say that I never heard any of that, but it's not that funny.
Yeah. So how did your approach change then, I guess, with each Crash game? So, I mean, Crash 1 was very much more of a sort of atmospheric soundtrack. It was sort of more sort of almost scary. It almost had like sort of, not horror, not quite horror, but like sort of just eerie sort of sounds. And then, of course, by the time you got to Crash Team Racing, you had to change that up to suit a fast-paced, very fast-paced racing game. So how did the approach change for you?
Well, a lot of things played into that. I mean, when you think about the levels in Crash 1, a lot of it takes place outdoors. There's sort of a lot of nature in that game. And, I wanted the music to really tie into what you were seeing in terms of visuals. So and also the creative brief, they wanted things to be more ambient. So, the combination of those two things led to the Crash 1 music sounding the way it sounds. And if you notice once you get into like the castle and all that kind of laboratory stuff, it starts to sound a little bit more video game like, once you get into the embryo world. So, and after I'd written the music for the Hog Wild level, that got a really strong response from Naughty Dog and from my peers at Mutato. And that's kind of what I was waiting for, was sort of like this kind of universal, thumbs up from everyone saying, this is really funny, this is great. And that sort of, I carried that over into the Crash 2 game. And it actually made sense on some level with Crash 2, because I think that everything was sort of improved in terms of like, it actually looked more like a cartoon.
Yes.
In my
very much so
estimation. So it seemed more appropriate. And I still tried to keep things pretty interesting in terms of like, what instruments I was using, and kind of mixing up unexpected, collisions of melody and little riffs. And, I tried to develop sort of a style based on all that. And I think by Crash 2, there was definitely a more defined sort of Crash sound. And to your comment about the racing game, that was definitely like, okay, this is a racing game. It's all very fast paced, and that's why it all pretty much has like a driving beat under it.
Yeah.
So that's what it calls.
And even gets quicker as well, I believe, when you go on the last lap.
That's right. Yeah, and that was definitely like a programming move, because these were all MIDI sequences. They were able to program in a tempo change. So that was
without
actually
having to pitch up. Yeah. Yeah, if you had
I mean, that was like a kind of a positive thing about delivering MIDI sequences. You could have that rather than some weird time stretch thing, which sounded all, heliumed out or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So did you have a favorite Crash game that you worked on?
Well, I don't think I can answer that question in terms of as a player, but as a composer, I think definitely once we got into Crash 2 and Crash Warped, I felt like I had sort of won the confidence of Naughty Dog, and I was encouraged to go in a specific direction. So I'd say by about halfway through Crash 2, we really locked into like a style that everyone was really into, and it actually really felt just like we were having fun at that point. And I was cranking it out faster and faster and getting better and better responses. And so that was definitely, so in terms of that dynamic, I'd say that the Crash 2, Crash Warp was kind of the sweet spot of those things. And the Crash Team Racing was like sort of fun, but I was actually working on another game at that point. So I mean, I didn't phone it in or anything, but I was sort of less immersed in the Crash Team Racing music.
And I'm guessing that you enjoyed with Crash 3 sort of with a lot of the different time periods as well, creating stuff that sounded like Crash, but it still had your signature sound, I guess, but in sort of more, like Egyptian and like Arabic and stuff like that. I'm guessing
50s.
50s, yeah, 50s motorbike. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, every level was quite different from the last. So I mean, that was sort of the challenge in it. What really was to make sure, even though on these games we're really working from main themes, so it was maybe a little bit of a challenge to keep everything still sounding like it was coming from the same soundtrack, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And so moving on to Jak and Daxter, Naughty Dog, how did they approach you for doing Jak and Daxter? I'm guessing it was based on, Crash Bandicoot being such a success and enjoying your work there. Is that what it was like, or did they want something different, or what was their mindset for hiring you again?
Well, we had a good relationship for the Crash game, so they definitely wanted me involved in Jak and Daxter, and that was all kind of sort of squared away while we were doing Crash Team Racing. So there's a little bit of overlap in terms of being hired for that game. There was definitely kind of a shift because it was a PS2, and they were able to do so much more with their game in terms of visuals and how the game was laid out and the more free roaming environments. The only drawback was really in my department, because I still had to deliver these MIDI sequences as opposed to streaming audio, and it was a bit of a challenge to come up with music that felt more lush and more cinematic given these limitations, technically speaking. Similarly
with Crash Bandicoot, what went into sort of making the iconic sound of Jak and Daxter? And I guess by extension, the Jak series, but I guess we'll start with the first game because that was a bit different.
I think all three kind of are pretty distinct in their approaches.
Yeah.
The first Jak game is much gentler and doesn't require a lot of like high energy music. So much like the first Crash game was sort of more atmospheric and pastoral or ambient, that was sort of the similar approach to the first Jak game. And Jak had sort of a makeover for Jak 2 where, he was talking and he had a weapon and he was like, Dark Jak. And that definitely informed how the soundtrack kind of shifted. And by the time we got to Jak 3, he had evolved even further. And just by virtue of the technical limitations being lifted from that game, I was able to sort of go even deeper into providing a much bigger sounding soundtrack.
So, what kind of VST plugins or hardware samplers did you use when scoring the 3 Jak and Daxter games?
For Jak and Daxter, I had a sort of a stack of sample CDs from various libraries, like North Star and, like we were saying earlier, some of the Spectrasonic stuff and East West, and I would load them into Roland samplers. So I think at that point I had about 4 Roland 760 samplers, and I was able to load those up. And I was also using some MIDI sound modules, like the Roland JV1080 was a big source for some of the string patches.
That's a really good one.
Yeah, and I tended to blend a lot of that stuff, especially with the more orchestral flavored stuff. I wouldn't just like grab, one string patch and call it a day. I tried to, find interesting combinations of string sounds, just to kind of like, I tend to get a better sound that way, and also it kind of keeps it from sounding too much like a product demo as opposed to the original score. So.
And has Jak and Daxter changed the way that you write music at all? I guess this ties into the next question about the action scoring as well. Yeah,
I think I learned a lot actually about scoring, especially on the third Jak game. It's definitely has a different flavor to it, and just in terms of the nuts and bolts of kind of quasi orchestral scoring, it was definitely a learning experience. Like how do I get away, or how do I achieve something that's high energy, that's not beat based. I was such a drummer about a lot of that stuff. Especially take Crash Team Racing, and that's what they wanted. They wanted it to be like a fast beat type situation, but I had to sort of achieve that level of intensity, but not using the drum and bass method. So it was definitely, okay, this is how you do it. This is how John Williams might do it. They come up with a string figure that's sort of like as sort of providing the pulse, and you're using percussion more as an accent as opposed to like being like this like thumping 4 on the floor thing.
And as a side note, I just wanted to note that it's sort of interesting. You've probably heard this before, but both you and Stuart Copeland, he did the Spyro soundtracks, you did Crash, both have drumming backgrounds. So it's quite interesting that you're very similar in that regard, I guess, even though your music is different overall.
Yeah, and it kind of trips me out to hear myself in the same sentence with him because, I'm a drummer from the 80s and like Ghost in the Machine was probably like one of the first 10 records I owned.
Yeah.
So I had Ghost in the Machine like when I was in 5th grade.
Wow.
And, I still like marvel at that guy's drumming. I mean, he's like, I don't think there's anyone else quite like him in terms of drumming. And I went to go hear him speak at LA College of Music. I guess it was about a year ago.
Awesome.
And he talked about his upbringing and about how he was, I can't remember where he was raised, somewhere in the Middle East, but basically his sense of like a normal beat was like informed by this whole like Middle Eastern pop music, where it wasn't like a standard backbeat type situation. And that's why, a lot of his rhythmic sense comes from somewhere else. It's not like he's aping something. It's actually like what he was exposed to at an early age. And I was just like, oh man, that's so amazing.
Yeah.
Well, that explains the rhythms.
It does. Like both in Spyro and some of his original compositions, which actually use similar. He actually has some tracks that he performs live, which use like cues from Spyro as well. So that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you go about doing the action scoring for Jak 2?
Well, that was tricky because that was still a MIDI-based soundtrack, and I had to come up with ways to, like I was saying earlier about the Jak 3 music, I had to like come up with inventive ways to keep that intensity up. And also, Jak 2 was an interactive score, so that presented a lot of challenges in terms of how the music was constructed. I had to compose it in layers and come up with little instrumental bits that would sort of address, whether you're carrying a weapon or riding on a hoverboard and all those types of different storyline scenarios. But I was still given a pretty limited bandwidth in terms of, the amount of samples that I could use and the sound quality. And Jak 2 was a very challenging game in that way.
And actually, was this sort of action scoring possible to do in Crash Bandicoot? I mean, it never really had a use, I guess, in Crash, but was it actually possible? Because I know that hidden within the Spyro game files, with a bit of trickery, you can actually do the same thing where you can change the track depending on the different state, like if you're on a skateboard, for example. So was it possible with Crash, or was it that was never really considered, I guess?
That wasn't really considered. It's all programmed, so if you're some sort of super genius, I'm sure you can go in there and tweak the tracks as you like, but that wasn't really part of it. And also, like I was saying earlier, the Crash game was pretty linear in terms of what your character has to do on any specific level. They weren't even called missions. There's like literally like, this is the snow level and this is the riding a polar bear level, so you're kind of on a one track. So
yeah, that's fair enough. So what made you want to take up a more orchestral approach for Jak 3 then? Sort of again another it had similarities from Jak 2, you could sort of hear it, but it was very different at the same time.
Well, I was sort of frustrated on Jak 2 because I know that they wanted something that sounded much more movie-like, because that's where things were going in terms of like the trend in games, and I just wasn't able to really fulfill that 100% because of all the limitations. So once I got started working on Jak 3, they told me, okay, well, you don't have to make this an interactive score, and lo and behold, you don't have to deliver MIDI files. You can actually give us stereo mixes. So I was like, finally.
Freedom.
My only complaint is that I didn't have enough time or budget to record a real orchestra, which is obviously where they went with Uncharted, to great effect. Greg's music for Uncharted is really spectacular.
So out of all the scores you did for Jak and Daxter, did you have a favorite?
Well, I think the Jak 1 music is really interesting, but how it ended up in the game is maybe not quite up to par. So when I listen back to the pre-console mixes of the Jak 1 music, I actually really like it quite a lot. But in terms of finished product, I have to go with Jak 3 just because, for everything that I've said so far about it, just by virtue of it being stereo mixes, it sounds, a million times better than the first two. So, and I actually think the compositions are stronger too. It's much more layered and interesting, and so I guess Jak 3.
And I guess it is interesting as well, sort of as a side note, but with the Ratchet and Clank soundtracks. David Bourgeot, his soundtrack, his Ratchet and Clank 1 soundtrack was actually, he made it all in stereo, but it all got mixed down to mono. So I guess you're not alone, I suppose, when it comes to like having your original work, having to basically strip it down in some ways. I guess you're not alone in that regard. I just think that's interesting, and arguably that's even, that's just it. If you listen to some of the demo tracks with it in stereo, it completely changes what he was trying to do.
It does. Like if you listen to even some like pad sounds, they actually have like a very, very wider surrounding sound in stereo versus the monophonic recordings.
Right, and I've heard this said in some other article. I think it was someone from Naughty Dog called the Jak and Daxter years their adolescence. Not just them as a company, but just sort of the gaming industry. It was definitely sort of an awkward period where, we had definitely gone beyond like the whole 80s, chip world or whatever.
Yeah.
And people, all of these game developers really wanted to do what they're doing now, basically. And so conceptually, they were right there, but just the, how it got executed. It's kind of like George Lucas when he did the prequels. It's like he wanted to do like all this kind of great stuff, but what he had available to him, technically speaking, just wasn't up to par.
Yeah.
So, we were all sort of in that same strange position to, like, oh yeah, we want it to sound like a movie soundtrack, but you could only, use those marimbas,
Yeah.
But make it epic. We wanted epic marimbas.
Yeah,
well,
I guess
this is like a side note, but this is why I think the PS2 era is one of the best eras, because nowadays we have PS4, which is like, they can do anything they've ever wanted to do on it. And it sort of takes away that limitation. It sort of takes away the creative drive to want to do better, because how can you do better than a PS4?
I don't know. I'm not really like in the gaming industry as a developer, so.
But it goes down to the same thing with the music too. Like how like back then you had to use like MIDI samples, and now you just get a real orchestra. Now I can just use like you said, aforementioned before, East West, and have like a real sounding orchestra, like right there.
Right. I think if anything, it's sort of homogenized the way a lot of game soundtracks sound these days, and that's not to dismiss, orchestral scoring, but you run into the same problem or the same issues in the film world too, where you have this sort of like accepted sound as to what a sound, quote unquote epic soundtrack sounds like, and to my ears, a lot of it kind of sounds the same. It's just kind of like everyone's sort of imitating each other or imitating Hans Zimmer or whoever.
Yeah, Zimmer.
But then again, you have things like, I don't know if you guys are hip to the Far Cry soundtrack that Cliff Martinez did.
Yeah, I've heard a bit of it. Yeah.
That's some great stuff, and it's interesting, and it feels very widescreen and very well produced, and kind of unpredictable, and so that kind of gives me hope. It's like, oh, okay, so Cliff Martinez is a film composer by trade, but he's doing a lot of different types of jobs, and you put him in front of a game, and like, woo, it's like, because his film scores are unconventional too.
And I think as well, I think another example of soundtracks that are quite sort of still feel like they're new and fresh is a lot of Japanese video game soundtracks. Still, they've gone a lot. They still haven't entirely, I guess, embraced, just going down an orchestral direction. You still hear a lot of electronic. You hear techno. You hear like hard trance. You hear all sorts of genres playing out in their games. And I guess that's the one thing I kind of, not to be too like nostalgic, but that's kind of the one thing I do miss about a lot of the old games, is that it felt like, with your stuff and the Ratchet and Clank stuff and Sly, like all of it was different. Whereas today it sort of feels, like you were saying, a bit more homogenized now that there's the total freedom to do anything you want. It's like, there's now like an industry standard, but I guess that's more of a comment on the video game industry in general rather than just music,
Right. I think that because, the gaming industry is so far reaching now that you have all sort of different echelons. You have your your AAA games, which are clearly kind of expected to deliver a certain kind of experience and a certain type of game that kind of behaves in a certain way. And then you have this whole universe of like indie games where it's like, oh, this is like a retro game, or like I wrote a couple themes for this indie game where it basically looks like a Nintendo game, like an N64 game.
Yeah.
So it takes there's all kinds of things going on.
And I guess there's also that middle ground, which I do consider the, I guess, video game middle ground to be like 3D platformers in terms of who they aim at their demographic. Like you have the more violent games with the sort of like orchestral, and then you have the chiptune sort of retro styled, and then I guess ukulele, stuff like that, which is a new game that came out, 3D platformer. Again, sort of goes back to the N64 era, but it's not quite chiptune. Do you know what I mean? Like sort of some. I guess it's like, I would categorize it as kind of like your music, where it's like it has that whimsical sort of vibe, but it's not quite retro. Like it's not 80s. Put it that way. It's not 80s.
Yeah, and that's probably the whole thing. I mean, not the whole thing, but a lot of that sound from the 80s is really the General MIDI palette.
Yeah.
Which all those composers were forced to use. It's like kind of like how I mean, if you listen to any like Atari home video games, from way back, I mean, that's the stuff I grew up playing. It's like, all that music is, sounds like it was being played like on a calculator, it's like.
Yeah, very much so.
If you know what a calculator is.
Well,
no, we still do.
I was watching a bunch of videos on it, but I learned that the Nintendo, the NES has like 4 voices. Like it has like, a saw, has this, there's a sine wave, there's a square wave, and there's a pulse wave, and there's like a DCM noise, and that's all they had. So the limitation.
That's all you need, really. That's all you need.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's like having a,
Yeah, I guess it's more versatile than a lot of other things. So, speaking of synthesizers, samplers, what do you like to use, in some of your older projects, not Crash or Jak, and even current stuff now? What's your weapon of choice, I guess?
Well, it depends on the project, So, I mean, as far as like the basic hardware goes, I mean, I run Digital Performer as my MIDI sequencer, and I use DP digital audio interfaces. And as far as my sounds go, I have, a handful of software synths, and I have a couple hard drives filled with custom samples that I load in to the Motu digital sampler. And, whenever possible, I try to add in, live instruments too, to give it sort of that human quality. But again, it all depends on what the project is. So maybe there's something that requires all 100% synthetic techno stuff, so I wouldn't be grabbing my nylon string guitar for that, obviously. So it depends on the project. I mean, digital audio has definitely been like the big that was the big shift, I think, from like 20th century to 21st century. It's like, oh, now you can like really grab a guitar and like all these amp simulators and like things just like one after another, it sounds better and better. And so your palette just keeps growing exponentially with every passing year.
Yeah, very much so.
Have you ever owned any like analog synthesizers before, like a Moog or a Nord? Like ever owned one?
Yeah, I have a mini Moog from the 70s.
Oh wow.
And it's great. That thing is like, I mean, whenever I have that thing turned on for more than 20 minutes, it's like you can just go right into it. I mean, it's like it's bizarre. I mean, those things are like haunted or something like that. There's like sounds in there that you just like couldn't even like think about until you get there.
So it's like a Model D you got.
Yeah, and you know what? The new ones are really badass. I have a friend who has one of the new ones, and he brought it over, and we plugged it in and kind of A/B'd it against mine, which is, I don't know when it's from, early 70s or something like that.
Probably from 1975.
Yeah, I don't know. There's no date on it, but it has like stickers of planets on it, so it's got to be pretty old. And I also have a Korg, a Maxi Korg, which is another 70s analog synth. Which is a pretty cool beast too. It's not quite as cool as the Mini Moog, but you can definitely get some good stuff on it. So those are my two like sort of main external keyboard synths.
Yeah.
And I borrow stuff a lot too. Like I love the Roland SH-101. So whenever I want to, play around with one of those, I have a friend who has one of those who will lend it to me. My brother actually has a pretty huge synth collection. Unfortunately, he's on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, so it makes,
bit inconvenient.
that kind of pretty impossible. But, he's definitely like my go-to guy as far as like, how do I get this kind of sound? If I'm like listening to a record from, whenever, and I'm hearing a certain synth sound, I call him up and say like, hey, what's that sound on that Kraftwerk record? And be like, oh, that's like a,
Must be so convenient to have that kind of technical knowledge or musical synth knowledge, just being like almost a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah, especially if you're into like, synth music, which I am. So.
Right. So as an artist, do you prefer solo work or collaboration work?
Oh, I like both, for sure. I mean, I play in a couple different bands, and I love working with other people. And even on, soundtrack stuff, I've worked with this director on a number of films, and he's also a drummer and a musician and a composer. So when it comes time for me to work on his films, it's all collaboration. And, it's great. It's great, really. But I also like doing solo stuff too, for obvious reasons. Sometimes it's good to just like have complete control over whatever you're doing. So I kind of require both in my world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So were there any video game projects that you were set to work on, but they didn't end up going through, or you didn't end up making them, or were there any projects that you had that just fell through in the video game industry?
Yeah,
that you can talk about, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, I can talk about this stuff. When I was at Mutato, I think it was either before or after Crash 2, we were approached by this Canadian developer who was tapped to produce one of the first Microsoft games. Oh. And this was before Xbox, so wow. The way I understood it is that Microsoft had either 10 or 12 games produced in full, and I think they released 2 of them. And I don't know which 2 these are, and I don't know what the other rejected ones are, but basically I wrote an entire soundtrack, which is all like pretty heavy guitar, not quite industrial, but it's programmed drums and programmed bass with live guitar over it.
Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like, like contemporary late 90s metal, basically. Cool. There's like elements of, it's not really thrash or like Metallica, but it's just sort of like a heavy guitar type soundtrack. That, and then it never happened, it never came out. So, I basically have this like hour of heavy guitar music.
Have you ever considered releasing it? Or is it under contract from the old days?
I think it's one of those things where it's like it was a work for hire thing like every other game, and they just sort of own it, and it's like sitting on some dusty shelf in someone's basement somewhere.
Maybe we'll hear it on some obscure game in 30 years or something. They've just found these old files, and yeah.
Well, I actually had one of the themes on my old website, and someone on SoundCloud was just like, when are you going to release the Condemned soundtrack? Like, how the hell do you know about the Condemned? And he's like, oh, you have that one track on your website. I was like, oh, well, that's right, I did. I completely forgot that I'd uploaded one of those tracks. This guy was just like, I want to hear the whole thing. And I'm like,
it just shows you how fanatical, fan base is. And this isn't not even a bad thing. Just how, I would consider myself very much fanatical about all the Crash and Jak stuff. It just shows how into it people get, and that you don't think twice about it, I guess. But then there's people that hear this new Josh Mancell music, and they freak out, and they want to hear more because they know you've got more.
You know what? I'm a big fan of all kinds of bands and artists. I go fanboy like that. There's bands that I see every time they come around, and I'll be right in front. So I get it. I totally get it.
Yeah.
I can get really excited about other people's stuff for sure.
Yeah. And so, what are you up to today? What are you up to these days?
I'm actually working on an indie film, doing sound design and music and ambiences for a sci-fi thriller. And I'm also juggling a couple different recording projects. One with my main band, Exploding Flowers, and then a new thing that I'm working on called Vagrant Winter. And then I've sort of been taking sketches that I've done throughout the years and sort of revisiting them as the Frequilibrium electronic thing. So, awesome. Just sort of juggling a bunch of different projects.
And is there anything that you want to direct the viewers here too? Like, is there any specific links, Twitter, the band pages and stuff like that? The soundtrack, anything you want to shout out? I guess it's all there.
I guess SoundCloud is probably the best place. I mean, if you want to hear like the soundtrack music that we've been talking about, the SoundCloud has quite a bit of Jak and Daxter and Crash Bandicoot music.
Yeah.
And also lots of other film score stuff and stuff I've done for animation. There's some Clifford music up there. If you're into Clifford. Yeah.
Actually, that's one final thing I had to ask. How did you get asked to do the Clifford theme?
Well, I actually did the whole series. So that was a phone call that came into Mutato, and I just happened to be in earshot, and Mark was like, hey, they want us to demo for our PBS show about a red dog. And I'm like, oh, for the big red dog. Like, how do you know about that? I was like, because I grew up reading the books.
Yeah.
So, they didn't give us a lot of time, and I had just done a bunch of demos for a commercial, and I listened to them, and I was like, hey, this one's actually pretty cool, pretty catchy. And so I spent an hour or two sort of restructuring it and adding some stuff, and then they ended up really liking it. Even without lyrics, they just liked the piece of music. They said, this is like really, and it was kind of unexpected, really. I mean, like when you are demoing for TV, you don't know how many people you're going up against, but they really liked it, and that was just sort of like being at the right place at the right time with the right piece of music. So it just kind of went on from there, and I ended up scoring 65 episodes and got a couple of nominations, and there you go.
All right, well, that just about wraps it up. I'd like to thank Josh for coming on today. Thanks for speaking to us. I really do appreciate all the insight, all the information, all the stories. It's been great.
Thanks for having me.
It's been excellent having you.
You're very welcome. And yes, also as well, thanks to Andrew as well, my American counterpart. We were going, before we came into the podcast, we were like, should we go by our usernames? And then Josh is like, nah, it actually sounds better if it's just Andrew and Andrew, rolls off the tongue a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. All right. See you guys.
All right. Catch you later.
Yeah.
All right.